The Great Depression is f***ing weird. As of the morning of October 24th, 1929, things were booming. America was already the richest country in the world.
It's said now that our economy is the strongest it's ever been in the history of our country.
Skyscrapers were popping up everywhere, and people were indulging in the wonderful things that the Roaring Twenties had to offer, like refrigerators, the Ford Model T, and AirPods Pro 2. Sorry, I mean phonographs. Please don't put your head in there. After all, the average wage had risen 20% in the past decade, and people worked for fewer hours. Nice. But just 4 years later, the stock market plummeted 89%, industrial output fell by 45%, and a quarter of the population was unemployed. Worst of all, America was starving. Literally. People were so poor that even though the crop prices fell by 60%, they still couldn't afford to eat. In New York alone, 1 in 5 children was so malnourished that they could barely attend school. Yet, there was no war, no major natural disasters. So what the f*** happened? One word: money. To be more specific, a significant lack of it. You see, money is this funny thing. It's something I want but don't have. And it's not really real. Like, a toothpick company doesn't actually need money to make toothpicks. Thank you, Sherlock. It needs wood. But without money, it can't buy wood. And more importantly, it loses the reason to make toothpicks. Although money isn't real in the way that wood is real, it's an indispensable incentive for us to do things, for the economy to run. And when people have more money, they have more incentive so more things get done, and the country becomes richer. On the contrary, if we take money out of the equation, we get communism, where things went poorly. Really poorly. Anyway, when World War I ended, America had a lot of money. Gold. Even though people back then couldn't spend gold directly, it determined how much money the government could print. This is known as the gold standard. For example, in 1900, Congress set the gold standard at $20.67 per ounce, and America had around 19.35 million ounces of gold in reserve at the time. So in theory at least, the country had around $400 million in circulation. But why, you ask? Well, it's because people were smart. They didn't trust those pieces of paper from the government unless they were backed by something real, like, you guessed it, gold. That way, the government couldn't just print as much money as they wanted, though now they can. And if you really have trust issues, you could always walk into a bank and swap your dollars for actual gold, like this $20 gold coin. Pretty, eh? By the way, if you ever find some in your grandpa's basement, just send them to me. They're basically worthless now, I swear. So back to World War I. Thanks to it, America held 40% of the world's gold reserves, because selling to countries at war turned out to be very good business. And with more gold, America happily printed more dollars, which went straight into the pockets of ordinary people, because that's only fair. How else would it be? You think the Federal Reserve just hands it to big banks through very low interest loans? Yeah, it actually does. But here's what's interesting about banks. Aside from a place where you put your savings or occasionally rob, banks are where money multiplies. You see, when banks get money from the Fed, they don't just sit at home and count it. They loan it out to households and more often to businesses and charge interest. That's how they make profits. For example, Mickey Bank gets $1,000 from President Donald J. Duck because he's a duck? Yeah, sure, why not? So now Mickey Banks has $1,000 and that's all the money in the economy, since this is the United States of Disneyland. Mickey Bank then lends $900 out of that $1,000 to Minnie Mouse, as mice take care of each other. So, how much money does Mickey Bank have now? $100? Wrong! The answer is still $1,000. $900 loans plus $100 cash. Totally reasonable. And since Minnie now has $900, the money supply in Disneyland rose from $1,000 to $1,900. In economics, the initial $1,000 President Donald Duck gave Mickey Bank is called M0, and the $900 Mickey Bank loaned to Minnie is M1 or M2, depending on whether she keeps it in checking or in savings. Together, M0, M1, and M2 make up the total money supply in an economy. And the important thing about M1 and M2 is that they provide a crucial incentive and means for Minnie, or businesses and households, to produce and consume. The more M1 and M2 there are, the more gets produced and consumed, and the more the economy grows. So when we say a country is rich, What it really means is that more gets produced and consumed in that country. But to make that happen, you need money as the catalyst. Why you stopped? What's this video about again? The Great Depression? Oh yeah. So after World War I, America had a lot of gold and printed a lot of money, or M0, which in turn created a lot of M1 and M2, giving businesses and households more incentive and means to produce and consume. Couple that with technological innovations like forced moving assembly line, which increased productivity and reduced cost, and then increased demand for American goods from Europe because they got wrecked by the war. USA! USA! The economy boomed. From 1920 to 1922, the US economy grew by 40%, the fastest growth America had ever seen up until that time. And there's this thing called the stock market, also known as the place where you always buy high and sell low and should otherwise avoid unless your name is Warren Buffett or Nancy Pelosi. Hi, Nancy. However, during the Roaring Twenties, people believed the stock market was a place where you could buy high and sell higher, or never, because it could only go up. Spoiler alert, it didn't. You see, although the money supply grew by nearly 70% during the Roaring Twenties, which directly fueled the stock frenzy, it couldn't grow forever. So at some point, the bubble simply got too big and some people decided to sell, and that triggered
a bad case of diarrhea. I have a bad case of diarrhea. I have a bad case of diarrhea.
On October 24th, 1929, the Dow Jones dropped 12%, and then another 79% over the next 4 years. This is known as Black Thursday, widely considered to be the start of the Great Depression. But hey, you may ask, so some greedy motherfuckers lost their money in stocks. Why should the rest of the country suffer? Well, because many of those greedy mofos enter the stock market with loans from the banks. And banks, as we mentioned earlier, usually lent out 90% of the money they have. So when the market crashed, they were left with only 10% of the depositors' money, and anyone who wasn't fast enough to put their cash out lost their savings for good. So soon, the panic spread and the bank run began. People rushed to get their money out, let someone else get there first, even though their banks had nothing to do with the stock market. And overnight, thousands of banks shut down and millions of Americans lost their life savings. And like we said, money is the crucial catalyst for people to produce and consume. So when millions of households lost their savings, consumption dropped drastically, and so did production, because businesses had no one to sell to, which forced them to lay off workers, which in turn cut consumption even further. And that, my friend, is how an economy goes to hell. And hell it was. People became so poor that they couldn't afford food. They were
eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets.
Actually, they were eating the Hoovervilles, otherwise known as armadillos, which were on sale from Mother Nature at a 100% discount. After a delicious meal of Hoovervilles, people went back to their homes in Hooverville and went to bed covered in Hoover blankets. And when asked about how he felt about the situation, President Hoover answered that he didn't give a Hoover damn. But actually, he did give a damn by doing nothing. Like many economists at the time, Hoover firmly believed that the invisible hand of the free market will fix everything and it wasn't the government's place to intervene. However, that invisible hand just bitch-slapped him in the face and happily choked the throats of millions of struggling Americans. So unsurprisingly, in the 1932 election, Hoover lost to FDR by a landslide. FDR, unlike Hoover, didn't believe in the invisible hand of the free market. Instead, he preferred the strong hand of the federal government. And with that hand, FDR injected something into the economy it had long been starved of. Money. Money, money, where you might be, I've been seeking thee, I've been feeling so lonely. What are you doing? Nothing. Anyway, in 1933, FDR introduced his famous New Deal, under which massive infrastructure projects were launched, giving jobs to millions of unemployed Americans, and a social safety net was built, so people could afford something other than armadillos. In total, the New Deal injected around $41 billion into the US economy. To put it in perspective, that's 40% of the GDP in 1922. With that tsunami of money entering the system, households regained the means to consume and businesses the incentive to produce, and the economy finally started to improve. In 1939, the US GDP rebounded to its 1929 level, officially ending the Great Depression that ravaged the country for a decade. 2 years later, the enemy nation attacked Pearl Harbor, pushing America to initiate the biggest government stimulus project ever, joining World War II. Between 1941 and 1945, the federal government poured a whopping $300 billion into the economy, more than 7 times the spending of the New Deal, and the economy doubled in size. America then lives happily ever after. USA, USA,